Hi everybody, I'm Girl Writes What, and I thought I would just change up the pace here for anybody who was getting sick of looking at my kitchen, and I would give you all an armchair talk, just like the politicians do. And today's video is kind of a response to a video done recently by Stardusk, where he talked about female hypoagency. He suggested that the phenomenon of women feeling compelled to sort of shove their way into male-only or male-oriented spaces, and kind of starting to boss everybody around and police their behavior and their speech, that can be attributed to female insecurity. And he thought that insecurity probably stems from a perception, both in the culture and within individual women, that really all they bring to the table is their sexuality. To sort of put it more bluntly, women have a really big trump card, and it's really valuable. And because it's so valuable, he feels they don't feel like they have to improve their intellect or their skills or acquire assets and human capital, but just simply accentuate their primary valuable quality and use that to manipulate men and the environment. Unfortunately for women, that quality also peaks in value really early and then just steadily heads downhill from there, and that's something that he feels maybe eats away at their sense of self-worth, which then compels them to elbow into male spaces, prove themselves just as good as men, blah 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 blah, because they feel safer in numbers. And for women, it's usually all about comfort. They engage in group bullying from within the comfort zone of the herd, and they will especially put to work any males in the environment who are sympathetic to them and get them to do their bullying for them. Now, I'm not really 100% sure that this is what's going on, or that this is all that's going on. While it does seem to me that it is the women who either have very little in the way of sexual market value, or the ones who focus most of their energy on accentuating and maintaining their sexual market value because they really have nothing else to offer, who seem to be the most prone to that type of insecurity. To me, it really doesn't seem to be a conscious or even a subconscious behavior that's based on any kind of measurement or assessment of value, that's going on in women's minds. Like, that is, I don't think this is something that can necessarily be ascribed to a reaction of any kind to any kind of self-awareness or existing awareness of existing conditions in the environment. In the language of Buddhism, it's just an is. It's just that way. Now, I'm going to make a disclaimer that, yet again, that everything I'm about to say is my own conjecture based on what I hope is sort of a logical assessment of a bunch of connected social and biological dots. Hypoagency really is an excellent word for society's perception of women and for many women's perception of themselves. Just look at what happens when you finally convince a feminist that the pay gap is essentially 100% due to women's choices of vocational field and their prioritization of flexibility, safety, and family over earnings. Their position almost always magically transmogrifies into one of women not really making these choices of their own volition, but instead being steered by social norms or guided by institutional sexism towards certain fields and away from others, of women not really wanting to prioritize family, but being forced to because men still don't do their share of domestic and childcare duties. All of a woman's freely made choices suddenly become women being steered or guided or forced by things outside of themselves. Those women portrayed as just completely ineffectual, like a leaf floating on a current. I keep wondering whether those feminists realize that they're talking about women as if they're objects without will, desire, or volition. But I'm not really surprised by it ever at all anymore. The same thing happens when you discuss women in politics. If women don't run for office, according to feminists, it's not a choice they're making either. Those women aren't being encouraged enough, or they are discouraged by institutional discrimination. Not enough is being done to get more women into politics. Again, women are not agents who choose or do not choose politics. They are objects who are gotten into politics. In other words, women don't make choices. Choices are made for women by society, by institutions, by circumstances, and by men. Women need not adapt their choices, actions, behavior, and priorities in order to become empowered through their own actions. Society, institutions, circumstances, and men should all adapt so that women, inert objects that they are perceived to be, can have an obstacle-free path along which they will be guided by encouragement, steered in the proper directions, and not forced to change course by any difficulty, real or imaginary, so that empowerment can be gotten for them. You get my point. Agents make things happen, and objects have things happen to them, right? In the gendered worldview of feminism and the wider culture, women cannot be counted on to make things happen. They must have things be made to happen for them. They're objects, not agents. And while I do believe that this perception of women is indeed attributable to vaginas, uteruses, and sex, I honestly don't know that there's any kind of thought process behind it, either conscious or unconscious, or any sort of realization or reaction to anything. I read an interesting paper a few days ago on global sex differences in personality traits. While the paper utilized data that had been collected in 1992 and used the same categorizations widely used by other researchers who had previously determined that sex differences were very small. Using different analytical techniques, these researchers determined that the overlap in personality between men and women was a mere 10%. When they adjusted the most statistically significant differences, they found that the remaining ones only amounted to a 24% overlap. The reason for this differing finding, based on the same data, lies in the standardized hierarchy of categorization that gets used in these kinds of measurements. Previous methodologies start with 5 or 6 basic personality trait descriptors, sometimes described as the Big Five. For example, extroversion. Extroversion is then broken down into subcategories such as warmth, affiliation, and dominance, venturesomeness. Women scored markedly higher than men in warmth affiliation, and men markedly higher than women in dominance, venturesomeness. Because these two subcategories are variants of extroversion, many researchers considered these results to indicate a small personality difference between men and women. That is, there was very little or no difference in scores between men and women in the Big Five trait of extroversion, even though the data clearly shows that extroversion expresses itself entirely differently in women than it does in men. A woman who scored 9 on warmth and 1 on dominance would have the exact same extroversion score and would be described by prior studies as essentially the same personality-wise as a man who scored 1 on warmth and 9 on dominance. Now, this kind of ridiculousness makes me wonder what the fuck university is good for if the people graduating are incapable of realizing that warmth and dominance are two completely different qualities when it comes to personality. But that's a topic for another day. One thing I did notice about these particular expressions of extroversion, warmth affiliation, provides significant and reliable potential benefits with a very low level of risk and at very little potential physical or material cost. Dominance and venturesomeness, on the other hand, has a bigger but less certain potential payoff, and the risks and potential costs of behaving in that way are exponentially higher. Warmth affiliation is a good long-term investment with modest returns, while dominance and venturesomeness is high-stakes gambling. I keep remembering the rules I was taught as a junior forest warden in my early teens whenever we'd go out on a wilderness hike. Our leader would take us some pretty hinky places, miles and miles from the nearest sign of human life other than the odd illegal leg hold trap we would stumble across. And we had it drilled into us that if we were ever separated from the group, the safest thing to do was essentially nothing. If you were in pairs orienteering and discovered you were well and truly lost, that's when you sat your ass down and didn't move. It wouldn't be long before the group would notice that there was a member missing or that you were way late getting back to the rally point, and when they did, they'd look for you. It would only be harder to find you if you were moving around, possibly in the wrong direction or in circles, and there was a hell of a lot higher chance of you ending up hurt or dehydrated or exhausted. If you wasted a ton of calories marching and a ton of time, possibly even increasing the distance between yourself and the people looking for you, you'd be screwed come nightfall. Safest thing you could do was stay hunkered down, exactly where you were, and call out for help every 30 seconds or so. Not only would you be found quicker, you'd have a better chance of surviving until you were found. So the safety rule was to become, essentially, an object. And it comes down to a simple formula. In that situation, being an actor means taking big risks, and being an object means avoiding those risks. In that situation, when you know there are people who are looking for you, behaving like an object is the best survival strategy. Now, the cost, benefit, and risk analysis would look very different if, for instance, you'd gone out alone and gotten yourself lost, if there was no group that you knew would come looking for you. In that case, turning yourself into an object and waiting for rescue from the group that doesn't exist is the opposite of a good survival strategy. All it's going to do is leave you freezing and thirsting and starving slowly in a hollow under a tree until spiders start spinning webs on your clothes and you're too weak to do yourself any good. In that situation, acting means surviving. Now, because of their innate value, all through history, women were more likely to find themselves in the first situation, where objectification was the equivalent of agency by proxy. Everyone, especially a woman's mate, had a vested interest in her survival. The more like an object she behaved within reason, the more agency others would take on her behalf, and all the risks and costs associated with acting would be borne by others. It might well be that the payoff to her of this strategy would be less than the greatest potential benefit of acting. But back in the days of tribal warfare, saber-toothed tigers, and staph infections that could kill you, the costs and risks of acting were often prohibitive. And men, of course, were more likely to find themselves in the second situation, where acting meant surviving and behaving like an object meant dying. And then when you consider the interaction of individual survival and genetic survival, depending on your sex, these differences play out in an even more pronounced way. Men and women have totally different sets of costs, risks, and investment in offspring. For women, the most burdensome costs, risks, and investment are rooted in their physiology. She carries the child. She breastfeeds the child. Her child is dependent on her body, and therefore the survival of her offspring, her genetic survival, is an agenda best served by her survival as an individual. The more careful she is, the fewer risks she takes personally, and the fewer of the external costs that she can get away with paying in terms of labor and effort above and beyond that necessary for gestating, giving birth, and lactating, the greater the chance that her offspring will survive. Her best strategy for both genetic and individual survival was to find a mate who would take on the bulk of the external risks, costs, and investment. An agent to act on her behalf, to risk on her behalf, and to pay on her behalf. Because her genetic survival is dependent on her individual survival, and individual survival is best served by avoiding unnecessary risks and costs, the women who, back in the cave, selected mates who helped them avoid those costs and risks were the most successful at producing many children who survived long enough to also produce children. Men, on the other hand, bear no significant biological costs or risks or investment in the business of procreation. A man's best strategy was to secure a mate by proving he could facilitate her share of the job by taking on as much of the external risk, cost, and investment as possible. Because he had to compete with other men for mates, evolutionary pressures selected extremely effectively for these traits in males. A lot of men died before they had a chance to reproduce. Geneticists estimate that we're descended from twice as many women as men. That's twice the evolutionary pressure on men to be actors. At the same time, many of the men who won the genetic lottery won big, way bigger than any woman could ever hope to do. Genghis Khan is believed to have sired hundreds, maybe even 1,000 children, and he didn't do it by being a mild-mannered and cautious accountant who lamented a paper cut. He did it by acting in a big way, taking on huge risks with potentially abominable costs. And that's going to be the case whether his mates selected him or whether they were forced into the role of bearing his children. To further complicate things for men, even your average non-warlord type, men's individual and genetic survival are just not as dependent on one another as they always have been with women. An extremely geeky pop culture example of this would be from the movie The Terminator. Kyle Reese dies protecting Sarah Connor, the mother of his child, before that child is even born. And while the survival of his child would arguably have been even better served had he succeeded in protecting Sarah Connor and surviving himself, it wasn't contingent on it. In fact, by deprioritizing his own individual survival, Kyle Reese was actually prioritizing and ensuring his genetic survival. In the past, the man who was not willing to act and take risk, everything up to and including his own well-being, in the service of a woman's reproductive agenda, was a man whose genetic line was likely to find its end in a crusty sock under the bed. Now, because avoiding risks and costs has always been the most successful strategy for women in passing on their genes, women have a kind of hyper-awareness of them and an innate aversion to any sort of agency that can't be managed or contained or whose risks and costs she would bear herself. Basically, any power or expression of power that can't be manipulated by her and thereby either rendered harmless to her or put into her service. The man who was not a tool in her hand was a potential Genghis Khan. And while Genghis Khan may have had hundreds of children, the woman who was raped by him may only have had one. Now, this is, I think, where all of this comes from, this invasion of male spaces. It's part of the reason why women are more afraid of violent victimization, even though they represent the smallest demographic of victims. Why you find women pushing campaigns to end violence against women when more children die from domestic violence than women do, and while more men die of all forms of violence than women do. This is also what's behind, in my opinion, what's behind that petition by the women of Britain to the king in the 1600s, where they wanted to have coffee houses banned. Men were congregating there amongst themselves, doing their own thing, outside of female influence, outside of female gender enforcement, and it's almost like there's this huge, deep suspicion as to what are those men up to. They must be contained. And it's also, I think, why you find these girl gamers who will charge into these video game communities and start making all kinds of demands as far as decorum changing, policing of speech, and when they freak right the F out when there's a female video character that is more superficially attractive than they are, because that female character may actually have a tighter hold on the agency of those males, might be able to influence those males more than she can. To women, male agency is an awesome thing, but only when it serves female drives, needs, and motivations. When it doesn't, it's either a potential danger to women, or it's just a waste of time and energy that those men could be spending looking after women. So the woman who wasn't, all through history, the woman who wasn't bending a man or society to her will through the tyranny of her hypoagency. That was the woman whose babies weren't born or who didn't live very long. And a man with power that couldn't be channeled or harnessed or rendered harmless by female manipulation was a waste of space, or a man who could destroy her. So here we have these two completely different sets of challenges, costs, risks, benefits, all of that, that required completely different strategies in order for men and women to be successful at reproducing. And they're all based entirely on the biological differences between the sex who carries the babies and the sex who doesn't have to carry the babies. And that's what led to these completely different personality profiles for the majority of men and women, with only a 10 to 24% overlap. What worked best is mostly what got passed on to the next generation and the next one and the next one. That's just the way evolution works. It doesn't have a conscience, it doesn't have a consciousness. It doesn't make value judgments, it isn't nice, and it really doesn't give two shits about whether something is sexist. Evolution isn't about who's right and who's wrong, or what's good and what's evil, or what's politically correct and what isn't. It's about who had the most babies and who didn't have as many, and about who had the babies that survived and who had the ones that didn't. 20,000 years ago, women who acted when they didn't have to, that is, when others could and would act on their behalf, were less successful at passing on their genes and seeing their offspring survive to pass on their genes, because acting is inherently risky and costly. Evolution selected against agency in women. The more of her agency a woman could exercise by proxy, by demanding or allowing things to be done for her. Does this remind you of any political movement that starts with F? The greater a chance she had of being reproductively successful. Evolution selected for hypoagency in women. Because men had to perform in ways that filled in those empty spots on women's spreadsheet of costs, risks, and investment, in order to get their shot at reproducing, they evolved to be willing to act, even though acting is risky and costly. Men who were not willing to act were genetic dead ends, selected out of the gene pool. And while a lot of men who did act were also selected out, genetic dead ends because they died in their acting, the actors who did win sired the most babies. Hypoagency was what worked for women, and the trait was passed down, as was the compulsion to manipulate male behavior to suit female ends, and the kind of hyper-awareness of agency and its risks and costs when it isn't contained, that leads to them invading all male spaces and trying to force them to be safe, force them to women's level of comfort, and also put as many individual men in the service of women's interests as possible. Agency was what worked for most men, and hyperagency, it probably worked for a lot fewer, since hyperagency really gets you killed. But for the few, the Genghis Khans of history, it really, really worked. And of course, all of this could indeed change over time. All of this hardwiring, since society and technology has created a completely different environment with entirely different challenges and totally different costs, benefits, and risks than the one we spent most of our evolution in. And as well, when everyone has a chance to pass on their genes, something that was served by the socially and legally enforced expectation of lifelong monogamous marriage, then the evolutionary pressures on men and women are going to change. But that's something that takes a lot longer than a millennium or two to work. And the very conditions that might have brought about those kinds of changes in our biology, changes that might steer women's evolution toward actually seeking agency rather than avoiding it, and steering men's evolution a little bit less in the direction of dominance and venturesomeness and all of those qualities of self-determination and agency. Those were social conditions that were essentially scrapped during the sexual revolution and the skyrocketing of divorce and out-of-wedlock birth that began in the 70s. And while I would agree with Stardust that women are certainly capable of being actors, it's not something that they're going to choose to do. Not the majority of them. They are not going to choose that. Not unless they have to. Not unless society forces that on them. They will act on their own behalf, even though it's risky and even though the payoffs are not always guaranteed, if there's no one that they can offload those costs and those risks onto by having those people take action for them. And frankly, with feminism leading the charge of social change, we're kind of headed in the exact opposite direction. We're headed towards ever more female hypoagency. On top of that, we've essentially gone back to 80% of the women having babies with 40% of the men. Men who fit criteria that worked in the cave, back when all of this was wired. And it's complicated by a state bureaucracy that has taken on the role of proxy agent on behalf of women, and which encourages female hypoagency. And it's happening in a cultural environment and an economic environment where the women who are the most capable of being their own agents are generally having the fewest babies of all of us. So I wouldn't look for any relief there either. In other words, to put it like a Buddhist, it's all gone Pete Tong, caveman style. Anyhow, that's all I have to say about that for today, and I'm hoping that I don't have people on my lawn with pitchforks and torches ready to carry me off and have me re-educated after I've blasphemed all over the place in this video, but we'll see. Anyhow, see y'all later.